Today we return with SRD Talk, taking a look at a system that is primarily narrative focused, but has a pretty interesting dice mechanic system that I think you'll all find quite fascinating. Hello, and thank you all for joining us again here today on Hessens County for another SRD Talk, this time taking a look at the Motif Toolkit SRD. This is from Thought Police Interactive. Um, the Motif Way, as it's described, uses the Creative Commons Attribution 3.0 unported license. So this is, the slightly older version of the Creative Commons license, which does mean that you can use this system for creating your own commercial games that you wish to commercialize. Um, as I mentioned, this is a more narrative focused system, so it does focus on more broadly describing the characters and the particular actions they're attempting to take, and the sort of play by play of what's going on in the game. So again, there's your broad description, less focus on gritty mechanics. It does feel like it's designed to encourage more emergent storytelling than some others. Uh, and before we kind of dive into the SRD itself, I want to talk about what all exactly is in the manual itself. And that is, it's primarily four parts. The first bit is the core oracle, which is the actual dice mechanics behind it, which are pretty unique. Um, then there are a series of patches. There is a section that's primarily discussing what it refers to as SRD patches, but basically what these are modular concepts that you really need to be thinking about whenever you're attempting to create a game using this system. They are pretty generic and generalized, though, when it comes to the descriptions and stuff and suggestions. And so I would see these particular aspects as not being mechanics, certainly not being mechanics in many ways that they're described with certain exceptions, but rather advice on ways that you can think about these particular things. The official patches are more specific. These are actual mechanics that are much more specific that have been used in existing games by Thought Police Interactive that utilize this system. Finally, there is last section at the end that I'm not going to be touching on today, actually, at all. That aside from here, that's primarily focused on advice and notes for creators who are either creating using this system or running games in general. Um, and particularly a like sort of like one page little article talking about bleed and role play, which I feel would also be another thing, just like the SRD patches, would be useful for a person to kind of think about whenever they're creating a game. So let's hop into the oracle here. So again, the core oracle is the particular dice mechanics that this sort of operates under. The idea is that you are rolling 3d6, a higher being a more positive result. However, unlike some other pool d6 systems, that you're not adding these numbers together. Instead, each of these individual dice is at least in a standard roll, is each measuring a different thing. So our first dice is simply trying to describe the answer to the question that we're asking when we roll the dice. There are different ways that you could potentially do this. So, for example, you could have just a generic yes, no. Of course, you could also have a yes, mix, no. So, this in many ways would be like a yes, yes, but, or no. Another option that is discussed in the manual is that if you already know that this generally is going to be successful, and it's just more a question of like how much the character is going to take advantage or potentially pay for this particular action that they're doing. You could do a range of costs and gains where a really low roll means you're going to be, potentially uh, having to sacrifice or pay more in order to get this thing done. While the higher up you go, you're going to be paying less, or even potentially not paying anything or getting stuff, or at least gaining some extra benefit from this particular thing. The second die would instead be focusing primarily on the impact of the action that is occurring because of the question. So we could use this to measure the strength of an action. where of course low rolls means that this isn't really having very much of an impact at all, to high rolls meaning this has a very large impact in relation to the intended impact or audience. So, for example, um, let's say a person's making a speech. This could measure how influential they are in a particular individual, or it could be measuring the range of the impact on the audience. So, the number of people you're convincing, or how strongly you're convincing them. Those are different ways that you could potentially utilize this particular dice, at least in a social situation. Another way that you could use this, if you don't necessarily want to be measuring the impact of strength or action because it's kind of already set in the way that the action's happening, is you could use this in a similar way to the way that other dice systems have dot 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 and or dot 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 but options. The third die is primarily being focused on flavor. This one is going to be primarily focused on somehow connecting the action or the role that we're discussing to the base core themes of the game. Um, so, for example, if I game one of the primary aspects or themes of the game is exploration, then presumably, frequently, the roles that are being done are going to be trying to discover or learn new things. Um, so, we could have a discovery flavor. You're doing sort of like a horror, then maybe or survival. Maybe this is a safety die where yes, you do your action, and here's your impact, and here is how it impacts your long term, your medium to long term safety. Um, so, for example, if I'm doing an action and I'm really successful, but I rolled really low on my safety die, maybe, yeah, sure, you're able to defeat this character, but you made a lot of noise and now the zombies are coming for you. Or if you're doing like a Cthulhu or maybe sort of like cosmic horror or maybe a magical realism game, like let's say Changeling. There could be like a weirdness die where with how high or low you roll on that could potentially move a tracker that could end up with you potentially revealing yourself as being not quite human. So yeah, as I mentioned, how we interpret not only the dice rolls, but what types of the flavors or things we might be throwing into this roll, it really is dependent on the question being asked. Some rolls might just need two of those three dice. In which case, you're still rolling three dice, but your extra die just gets counts as a flavor. Or maybe you just need flavor. So, just an example, let's going back to a survival game. My character finds a car. Okay, I have a car, or I have found a car. I don't need to really roll to see if I'm successful in finding the car. I already know where it is. Um, so maybe, and as I'm inspecting the car, so maybe I'm just rolling three flavor dice, and one of them tells me what the physical condition of the car is. Another one tells me like how useful this car would be for me as a vehicle. So like, does it have gas? Does it seem to be um, have the various consumables it needs in order to operate properly? And then finally, just are there other useful things in this car that could be helpful to my character or the group? Like, is there a crowbar in there, or fire extinguisher, or extra oil, or food, or whatever? These are all different ways that you can potentially play different. You're still using three dice, no matter rolling three dice, no matter what, but playing into these three dice in different ways is very useful. Now, as I mentioned, I'm not necessarily going to go into super detail with these SRD patches. There are a number of them, but many of them are either relatively self-explanatory if you're familiar with other narrative systems, or you watched some videos on this channel that dives into narrative systems, um, or they're just or this the description that's given in the toolkit is kind of vague. So for example, modifiers, obviously, most games have some form of modifier based on what's going on in the narrative or character, uh, the character might have some particular modifiers. Obviously, in narrative games, these are often straight descriptors of the character. The game suggests only really having like a +2 or -2 at most when it comes to actually adding raw bonuses or penalties to dice themselves. Another way that you could potentially add, character based or narrative based modifiers would be that maybe certain mods only apply to certain dice. Like your character has an ability so that whenever you're rolling flavor dice on one of the themes associated with the game, then maybe the modifier only affects that die. Another thing is that you could potentially have your character be able to swap dice around. So instead of having this particular die that you rolled impacting the flavor die, maybe instead it impacts the action die, the actual success or failure roll. Sequences are just basically a description of like how you decide to run basic whenever your characters need to like be taking turns and stuff inside of a scene themselves. It basically the way they suggest doing it would be like, okay, every character has during their turn has the ability to either do uh, has the ability to do a talking action, a doing action, and a conflict action, and for each turn you can take instead of doing your conflict action instead you could do two doing actions, or instead of doing any of your doing actions you could potentially do talking actions instead. It also provides some basic advice on how you might want to be handle PC conflict, which is generally not necessarily the most common thing in narrative games, so that's pretty interesting. And then, of course, it uses a pretty basic, a pretty, or at least pretty common, rather, not basic, system when it comes to obviously whenever things happen to your characters, then they might gain conditions. And these, of course, are resulting in narrative limitations, which means maybe your character can do certain actions. Like, obviously, if my character has, I don't know, a broken arm, then, doing gymnastics is clearly not in my future. And then, of course, it also suggests that when we're repairing certain conditions, or healing certain conditions, which again primarily narrative focused. Although obviously you could introduce mechanics that could potentially boost that, like special abilities or whatever. Um, these can potentially result in the accumulation of scars, and accumulating a certain number of scars could potentially mean that your character has to retire from play. It also introduces a number of what it refers to as character mods. These are most of these are pretty generic. Um, Again, we've got resources, by which, of course, they mean like you're gonna have to track certain items or concepts or like favors from people and things like that. These would be kind of falling under resources. Um, those, of course, attach pretty strongly to pools, being like obviously groupings of things that you might need to track and then potentially share amongst characters. Um, Expert roles is actually an interesting thing where it suggests that depending upon the PC expertise, a character might need to roll a special type of role. Um, and here is one of the places where it actually suggests like whenever your character has a particular expertise in this thing, maybe you or have the ability to swap around dice. And that's again a pretty interesting way of kind of approaching that instead of adding or subtracting numbers and stuff like that. Abilities I'm not going to dive into, but because this is pretty self-explanatory, essentially, giving your character certain special abilities or whatever, depending upon the type of play or system you're running. Um, these might exist in certain games that you create, like for example, obviously magic, superheroes, stuff like that. And but in other ones, like for example, if it's just a raw survival sort of zombie game or something, maybe having special abilities doesn't really fit. And instead, you're focusing more on like the skills of your character, in which case you'd be focusing more on modifiers and these expert roles. Finally, it does, of course, describe advancement. Again, these games are primarily more focused on emergent play, sort of short role playing sessions. So advancement's a bit less important, but it does emphasize that there really should be, at least in the minds of the creator and the people running the game, a difference between losable advancements and permanent gain advancements. Permanent gain, of course, being more like abilities or a permanent boost to the cap of a pool or resource or whatever, um, or gaining an expertise or new skills in something. While losable things would be, of course, basically just like gaining currency and resources and stuff like that. Then, of course, our last section is discussing gameplay mods. Many of these are pretty similar to what we've discussed in previous narrative systems before. So, for example, it's a good idea to create templates in order to make things easier for your game for the running of the game. Um, Counters are obviously would be just like physical things that are helping you keep track of things. Tracks, of course, are going to be very familiar for anyone who's played games that involve primarily like clocks and things like that. Um, in order to just track things going up and down, obviously. And then triggers is again this is a more interesting thing that it introduces in this section where it suggests that obviously when certain things happen during play, for example, rolling a pair of doubles in your 3d6s, maybe that triggers something to happen. And in fact, we'll discuss in a bit an example of something where rolling triples or rolling doubles could potentially result in some could trigger something to happen in the course of play or some other mechanic. In the third section in this manual, as I mentioned, we're discussing the official patches. These are the ones we're going to go into more detail on. And these official patches are primarily attempting to describe things that already exist and have been created. So that's why these are more fleshed out actual mechanics. So the first one that is described in the manual is twists and turns. Turns being a major shift in a particular scene. It suggests that there are potentially several dice based triggers that you might want to have. So, as I mentioned, rolling doubles or rolling triples might be a way where these could potentially set off. And then the value of the die roll actually dictates, like, how beneficial this particular turn might be for the roll for the characters. So it gives, for example, it gives a table on some things that you might want to actually have occur depending upon the value of the double or triple or whatever. So, for example, maybe if you roll fours, then a hostile non player suddenly arrives in the scene. So, let's say our scene is that your group is having a sit down chat with like the head of the local crime family. Um, and then all of a sudden, the police burst in. And of course, the police are going to assume, hey, you're here and you're discussing stuff with the crime boss, dude. So that means that you are discussing crime. So we got to arrest you, right? Turns then full into twists. So twists would be major shifts in the world as a whole, or the group, the larger play at hand, not just your specific scene or a particular subplot that your character's involved in, but like the whole shaping of the story or the world it exists in. And it suggests using a track to sort of where every single time you hit a turn, that adds to our clock or a track. And the game also provides a twist generator where you would roll 2d6 and take a look at the dice here, the table here to determine like what might be some of the options that occur. If I were to roll a 10 or an 11, hostile authorities make peace with our NPCs, or some major opposition figures switches sides essentially. So, like, again, let's say this is a political thriller. It turns out that this character who's been a major opposition, a major pain in the butt for us, basically, in let's say the House of Representatives. I don't know. um, Someone who normally would be opposing us is now all of a sudden starting to help us because it turns out that they've discovered that actually we're better off working together, maybe because um, we've found common ground on a particular issue or something like that. The second sort of more mechanical or gameplay mod that they suggest here is a mission clock. This is going to be very familiar to those of you who play various other games with clocks, like, for example, games based on Blades in the Dark or whatnot. But the important part here is that this is specifically a 12-step clock, and it's basically counting down to midnight. Positive action will pause the clock or potentially even reverse it a little bit, while other actions that the players either fail to keep from happening or direct failures by our player characters could potentially cause it to advance. And I don't mean like specific actions, but like let's say a scene goes horribly wrong, and so they could advance pretty considerably. Um, the most interesting part of this, though, in this the way it's described here, is that it actually suggests adding sections where there could be progressively increasing mission stress. So these would be mechanically described as progressively increasing penalties to particular types of actions at the 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and 9 o'clock position. So that once you go past that time on the mission clock, by the time you're hitting like 9 o'clock, obviously it's going to be really difficult for your characters. They're under high amounts of stress. Like the wheels are coming off, um, that kind of thing. Uh, so that way, in some ways, it actually kind of like piles on the stress and actually makes it harder and harder and harder as things go closer and closer to doomsday, whatever that negative thing that's going to happen at midnight is. The last thing we're going to be taking a look under the official patches is corruption. In this particular description, corruption is a sort of spiritual warping of the player character, and it's trying to pull them onto an evil path. This is tracked by levels of corruption that generally scale from 1 to 5, where if you get more than 5, basically your character's retired because they are completely like down the dark way to the point of being practically irredeemable. They feed into a separate track that tracks temptation. And temptation is specifically it's going to trigger like whenever you're going to need to make corruption rolls, which could potentially add new levels to that. Um, Unlike the corruption, which basically stays at certain levels, goes up to a certain level and stays there, temptation goes up and down based on in-game actions, things that are done to the players or done by the players. Again, the higher the temptation, the more likely it is that the player character will fail, will either have to do corruption rolls or potentially will fail corruption rolls and therefore will gain levels of corruption. So, just an example of some actions that they might have to do in order to gain or lose temptation. Um, so, for example, you're losing temptation could be doing things like banishing demons or dark spirits, um, having a extensive counseling, spending a substantial amount of time invested in uplifting your community or helping the marginalized or unprivileged, um, things like that. Meanwhile, gaining temptation could be things like some sort of close connection to you or a loved one is injured, killed, lured into evil, or somehow damned. A serious failure on a case or a mission attempting to defeat evil forces, uncovering forbidden knowledge, dark magic, or attempting uses for corrupt methods and its works. So for this in many ways reads really strongly, I'm sure, to some of you to be like, oh, this is like the corruption of the Ring and the Lord of the Rings, or um, uh certain systems, the magic is tied really heavily to the temptation to utilize um shortcuts that can like the blood mages in the Dragon Ages games, where they're taking a shortcut to power, and it can kind of corrupt them to a certain extent. um as you gain more temptation, you can potentially trigger corruption checks. You get again, you're beginning to feel a constant urge to use shortcuts or use your access to corruption or corrupt agents because of your position, um, in order to like save things because it's convenient, or um, yeah, or you might have to make corruption checks whenever you're faced with certain situations. So here it says like if you're above a 6 on you're at 6 or above on the temptation track, then you'll need to do corruption checks whenever you have the opportunity to act cruelly or inflict damage upon those who have wronged you or your supporters, your clients, or whatever. And then as you gain more corruption, there are physical and behavioral signs to it. Um, this system in particular, I think, feels like it could be really useful for other games. So, for example, you can modify this, and maybe this is, instead of talking about a spiritual corruption, this is talking about an actual practical, like monetary and political corruption. Um, and the further you're kind of diving into it and being tempted by it, so for example, like in a this could be something that could tie into some sort of deep, strong corporate background in the world that your players are having to kind of act against, or again, authoritarianism or stuff like that. Um, or you could again have this be more spiritual, or maybe there's some sort of magical system, like I mentioned in Dragon Ages, or like Elrica Milleborn's. He has that black sword that absorbs souls. Uh, those are all different things that could potentially tie into this corruption. Now, my final impressions of the Motif Toolkit. The core oracle, I feel, is a very useful concept that could be useful not only as is in this system where you have like different dice and they're measuring different things, and what they measure depends on the situation. But this also could be used to adapt to your own preferred method. So, for example, I might utilize a core oracle like this, but maybe instead of using a d6, instead I'm using a d10. So it gives me more range to be able to like adjust things back and forth, or add bonuses and penalties without it being like really swingy. Um, or also, it could give me, if, for example, if I'm doing a flavor die, I could actually create tables where if certain things are rolled, certain things happen based on that particular flavor, um, or at least give me a feeling of more scale. As I might have mentioned previously, another advantage of this particular toolkit is that a lot of the stuff that's talked about in it is kind of agnostic to the motif way, either because the individual mechanics described in it could be adapted to other systems, um, or it could be um it's just pretty general advice for a lot of different types of more narrative style games. um Finally, I would definitely make sure that you keep in mind that this is definitely a toolkit and an advice source, and not a freestanding like plug and play system. We have looked at toolkit SRDs that essentially describe a game that has essentially all of the serial numbers filed off, but it is still a fully functioning, can 100% be run as a game out of the box with just some flavor text, and there you go, you're done. Um, or at the very least, you have like a very, very strong sound structure that can run on its own, and then it comes with like strong mechanical sections that you can like bolt on or off. In this particular instance, I would say that it doesn't fall into that category, in many ways, because while that core oracle is a useful concept, it's really hard to run a game with just it as it is. You're going to need to create and craft all of the stuff that goes around it, and again, it gives you advice on how you could do that, but it doesn't, with the exception of the couple of mechanics like the twists and turns and things like that. It's more of giving you, here are things you can think about, or here are things that you should consider, and not like basically saying this is a way that we've done it. So in that case, you'll need to either take a look at other games that utilize the motif way, in which case you can't necessarily borrow the way that those games do the mechanics, because again, they're not covered by the Creative Commons license that the toolkit's under. Um, with the exception of the official patches that they give you. So yeah, that was the Motif Toolkit SRD. Again, this was from Thought Police Interactive. Links to the toolkit can be found in the doobly doo down below. And yeah, don't forget to like, subscribe, of course, share this with other people who you think might find this particular toolkit useful and interesting. And have a good zone.